So the big news that a whole city, a whole state, a whole country, and indeed, it's fair to say many around the world were awaiting, has come through. Derek Chauvin has been found guilty on all three counts in the George Floyd case. So that's, as I understand it, second degree murder, third degree murder, and manslaughter. Um, am I surprised by that? Not very. I sort of, my gut feeling was it would go that way, I have to say. I didn't think he would be acquitted. The controversial comments made by Representative Maxine Waters yesterday, it's right that that was criticised. I think it was disgraceful that she came out with that. But what President Biden said when he said he was raising, the case was in his prayers, was that the jury was sequestered. In other words, they were blocked out from any news that was going on around this case. And one thing about this trial, I do think it's been handled well insofar as the jury were meticulously selected, they were scrutinised for any biases. So in that sense, I can't fault the process. Um, whether or not the defence team are going to lodge some sort of appeal for a retrial or something because of Maxine Waters' comments, I don't know. And if they did, I'm not sure they would get very far because it would probably just be ruled that many public figures have spoken about this. It's a very high profile case. Um, how do I feel about it? Well, it's good in a sense. It's good in that justice has been done. I've never defended Chauvin. I thought from the start that his actions went too far. The fact of the matter is, he pinned down a man for almost 9 minutes, a man who was repeatedly saying he couldn't breathe. I don't think there's any way to justify that. Um, I don't think there's any way to condone Chauvin's actions in that. But the problem here is the George Floyd case is being kind of held up as representative of all cases in the United States. Now, since then, in recent weeks in particular, there's been two other cases, a 13-year-old boy, Adam Toledo, and I haven't looked at that case closely, so I can't comment on detail, and Dante Wright, killed by the policewoman who mixed up her gun with a taser. Unfortunately, these won't be the last killings. You know, by no means is this going to be a situation where no other black man dies at police hands in America. But this brings me to a wider point. One of the main reasons I'm critical of Black Lives Matter is I feel that they oversimplify complex issues. Their whole narrative is that America is a deeply racist country full of racist cops who are just out to kill black men. But the reality is, there's also white Americans killed by the police that get far, far less coverage. And that's a fact. Um, and when we're looking at proportionality, why is it maybe proportionally more black men are killed by police? I'm not sure what the figures are, but you cannot just take that alone. You need to think, well, in a city like Chicago or St. Louis or Baltimore, where you have most criminal suspects are black, that's just a fact, then you need to look at that sort of context. You can't just say, this is one of the biggest problems I think in this debate. People are taking some of the components and treating them like that sort of explains the whole situation. So more black men are proportionally killed by police. That proves institutional racism. Well, does it really? Or does it say that there is a problem actually with a breakdown in communications between the police and the black community? Does it say that actually there is a problem with black criminality? Why is it in some places, some parts of the United States, black men make up a disproportionate number of offenders? That needs to be, discussed. And from what I can see, Black Lives Matter doesn't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about black criminality. But this is the problem in America. Race is such a hypersensitive issue that even saying there is an issue with black criminality, that's racism. Oh, you're demonizing all black men. Not at all. There's white criminals as well. Obviously there is. But I've always been a believer in where there are problems, they need to be discussed. So one thing that's come out of this case is this this loophole of qualified immunity. Now, I don't share this right wing school of thought that the police are always defending themselves and, oh, if only this person complied, everyone would be fine. I do think there has been examples of police brutality in America. I do think there's problems of police power in America. And the notion of qualified immunity, that police officers could potentially be above the law, is horrendous. That is something that needs to change. And I suppose if I was to be fair to Black Lives Matter, I'm critical of them for a lot of reasons, but to be fair, I suppose they have generated debates about issues like that. And it's important because you can't have a situation where law enforcement officers are themselves above the law. Now, hopefully, this guilty verdict in the Chauvin case will send out a message that they're not. Hopefully, that will send out a message to police officers that they can't just do as they please because they're wearing a uniform. And every police force in America needs to understand that. Powerful police unions need to understand it. I mean, in the Eric Garner case, they were making lots of threats against Mayor de Blasio because of his stance on the case. Um, they might say they're just representing the members, but they need to accept that their clients, their members, are not above the law. Um, I mean, it's a little bit like I've always taken the view that a soldier, if he or she abuses his position, just because they're in uniform doesn't mean that they're therefore above reproach. I've always said that that's something that needs to be taken seriously. If a soldier is accused of, for example, a war crime, it needs to be taken seriously. We can't just get nationalistic and say, oh, it's our boys, they can never do any wrong. It needs to be thoroughly investigated and taken seriously. Um, but I would add the caveat that I think the vast majority of troops engage in that sort of behaviour. I also think, for what it's worth, the vast majority of police officers, or let's say the majority, even in the United States, where there is a more militarized police, are probably decent people who are just trying to um, enforce the law. I do think there are issues around that. But I was looking at a debate thread on this, and someone said that this wouldn't happen in the UK. Well, there is again a different dynamic because America has a much higher homicide rate, and a lot of that is gun violence. So automatically, American police are facing a different environment. I'm not saying British police don't face dangers, they do, but it's easier to restrain someone with a knife than it is with a gun. And, a police officer going into inner city St. Louis or Chicago, there are real threats. It's naive saying that there isn't. Um, there's things already going on. When people were interviewed outside the courtroom, a black woman said what she was asked what she thought about it, and she said, "Justice hasn't been done. There's still institutional racism in this country." So she's not even accepting the guilty verdict, even though Chauvin's been found guilty. Her little girl was asked, and this kid couldn't have been more than 5, what she thought. She was wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. The little girl said, "I don't know." So that makes me think children are kind of being indoctrinated as well in this thing. It's it's just a very difficult situation because on one hand this is good news in the sense it sends out a message that police officers are not above the law. But I'm not so optimistic that this is going to change the divisions in America. There's still other cases. There's still going to be a whole question mark over the Dunphy Wright case, over the Adam Toledo case, over numerous other cases. I do think that each of them needs to be looked at in their own merit. What are the circumstances? What's the threat to the police? What are the aggravating factors? What are the mitigating factors? All these things need to be examined. Um, I think one thing about the George Floyd case is that actually transparency is important. And this is why I support, for example, police using body cams, because it's a win-win for everyone. Officers are just defending themselves and needing to use force. A body cam can help vindicate them because it would show the situation that they are in. Whereas the absence of body cams, then means that if the police are abusing the power, they will escape justice because it hasn't been seen. So I think that something that body cams needs to be looked at seriously a lot more. Some people might say it's not practical, but frankly, with the way things are right now, I think any money should be a secondary issue to de-escalating the tensions that are out there. Um, I don't know what President Biden will say on this. I imagine he will welcome the verdict. I imagine he will say more needs to be done. I'm going to look at the latest news on the hour. Um, but I still remain critical of the ELM in terms of some of their narrative. They send out the message that only black people are killed by the police. That is just not true. There have been white victims of police brutality as well. In some cases, very similar to black victims of police force. But that gets totally ignored. And that's important because by ignoring those cases, it does reiterate this message of institutional racism. But that's something that needs to be scrutinized more. You know, I'm tired of this notion that all these cases, it's just innocent people minding their own business. Frankly, there are situations when a situation where someone could have just been arrested and booked is made more complicated than people being confrontational. Now, I'm not saying that excuses police brutality. I'm not saying that there aren't police who escalate situations. There are. In fact, we had a case in London recently where a father in his 40s, I think he suffered a broken leg from a Metropolitan Police officer. So we don't have a squeaky clean record. Nevertheless, for Black Lives Matter to bring the narrative over here and the events that went on last year, I honestly believe they brought race relations back. I think BLM, I think they're bad news. I don't see them as just a civil rights group because the sort of things they've called for, defunding the police, um, constantly putting out this message of white supremacy and a deeply racist society, um, refusing to condemn looting or rioting or black criminality, that matters. It matters because most young black men in America will not die at the hands of police. They will die at the hands of other young black men. That's just a fact. I mean, look at the R&B industry. Whenever you hear rapper shot dead, it's barely news because it's such a cliche. It's such a big problem. So there's no simple answers to this. But I do think if you listen to CNN or left's take on this, they see it as black and white, no pun intended. You know, they see it as we have a deeply racist society. We need to address this. But how can you address it if you don't address issues like black criminality? Yes, it's important to address police power. Yes, it's important that police are held to account. Yes, it's important that police brutality is addressed. That's only one factor. There is a factor of black criminality. I'm sorry, but there is. And if that's racist to tell the truth, that's just very unfortunate if people want to be that reductionist in their thinking. But it's a sad state of affairs, it really is. And I just hope that this verdict will calm tensions down a bit. I think had there been a acquittal, I think there would almost certainly be violence in Minneapolis tonight, and it's good that that wasn't the case. But by no means I think this will end the situation. So just in conclusion, I'm not one of these people that always defends the police and says there isn't a problem, nor do I claim that there is no racism in America, nor am I claiming that black men in America don't face real challenges. I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is groups like Black Lives Matter oversimplify it, and I think that's a problem.